Death is hard enough to understand. What's harder is knowing it all started with one small mistake. I'm Nathan, and today I'm sharing 5 disturbing cases you'll never forget. From a worker dragged across the floor and crushed against a steel grate by one wrong valve, to a worker who skipped his safety gloves for a job he'd done hundreds of times before. It was May 22, 2015, at a regional water treatment facility in Sacramento County, California. Maintenance crews were working inside a drained storage basin, clearing sediment during a routine maintenance operation. Most workers expected to be finished by lunch. Down inside that basin was 39-year-old Logan Sterling. He'd spent 13 years with the county water department maintaining pumps, testing equipment, and doing the kind of work most people never think about. His co-workers trusted him because he stayed calm under pressure and never cut corners. Outside of work, everyone knew him as Coach Logan. 3 nights a week, he coached youth soccer for kids from immigrant families. He took real pride in showing up for people, whether it was a player, a neighbor, or a co-worker who needed help. That morning, Logan and 2 other guys were down in that massive storage basin for routine maintenance. Millions of gallons had been drained, leaving just a shallow, slick layer of water on the floor above the deep pumping station grates. The terrifying thing to me is that those pumps were supposed to be completely locked out and shut down the night before. Meanwhile, up in the control room, a 26-year-old operator was prepping for an afternoon startup. 2 nearly identical valve controls sat right next to each other on the panel, one for a refill line, the other for the massive distribution pumps. It's a classic awful design flaw if you ask me, and during a quick adjustment, the operator accidentally flipped the wrong valve. At 10:14 that morning, the valve flipped open. No alarms went off because the system thought it was a totally normal command. For about 30 seconds, nothing felt out of the ordinary. Logan was still down there, scraping sediment off the concrete floor. But then, things started getting weird. The workers noticed the muddy water on the ground starting to drift across the concrete. At first, one of his co-workers assumed the leftover water was just naturally draining out. But the pull got stronger. Buckets started sliding on their own, and tools slowly began drifting toward one corner of the basin. Logan looked over at the intake structure and immediately started moving away from it. Witnesses said that was the exact split second when the vibe completely changed, and everyone realized they were in deep trouble. The pumping station below had started kicking into high gear, pulling thousands of gallons of water every single minute. The actual water level on the floor barely changed, but a massive, invisible current spread across the concrete. Logan slipped in the slick sediment and dropped to one knee. Before he could even try to stand back up, the current completely swept him off his feet, dragging him several feet across the floor. His co-workers watched as he clawed at the mud, but there was nothing to grab. The current swept him into a steel intake grate, slamming his body against the bars. The water pressure pinned his chest, stomach, and legs so tightly that witnesses said his shirt appeared flattened against the steel. One co-worker grabbed Logan's arm while another secured a rescue rope around him. They pulled with everything they had, but he barely moved. Investigators later determined that several thousand pounds of hydraulic force were holding him against the grate. The harder they pulled, the more obvious it became that they couldn't free him. A supervisor called 911 immediately, and the firefighters got there about 11 minutes later. Rescue teams rushed straight into the basin while engineers frantically searched for the right controls. What really gets me is that several of his co-workers stayed right beside Logan the entire time, doing everything they could just to keep him awake. Eventually, his breathing became shallow, and then he just stopped moving. More than 20 agonizing minutes passed before the pumps were finally shut down. By then, it was just too late. The coroner ended up ruling the death accidental. To me, the most terrifying part is that Logan was pinned so tightly against that steel grate that he literally couldn't expand his chest to breathe properly. The medical exam found multiple broken ribs, severe bruising, and water in his lungs. In the end, the final cause of death was drowning complicated by traumatic chest compression. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage and control room logs and determined that the wrong valve had been opened less than 2 minutes before the emergency began. Afterward, the county redesigned the control system with new lockouts and safeguards to prevent a similar mistake. The loss was felt most on the soccer field. At the next season opener, players wore black patches in Logan's honor, and the county later established a scholarship to help local families cover youth sports fees. Logan never made it back to that soccer field, and the next story still bothers me because nobody was taking a risk, breaking a rule, or trying to cut corners. It all started with a missing syringe. It was March 4, 2017, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. On a cold, drizzly Saturday, everything seemed completely normal inside one suburban home. Let's talk about the guy at the center of all this, the 21-year-old Simon Lim. Simon had been dealing with epilepsy since he was a kid, so he knew his body and his condition better than most adults twice his age. He was a busy guy, worked part-time at a sporting goods store, played softball on weekends, and was going to community college to become a physical therapist. His friends loved him because he was just one of those incredibly patient, reliable, and determined people. For Simon, his medication schedule was his absolute lifeline. I can't stress this enough. Years of strict routine had kept his seizures totally under control. He almost never missed a dose. His doctor had drilled it into his head that consistency was everything, because even a tiny slip-up could trigger a breakthrough seizure. But on this specific night, Simon was recovering from a nasty stomach virus that left him super dehydrated and unable to keep anything down. Because swallowing pills was making him gag, his doctor gave him a temporary liquid version of his anti-seizure meds. Before Simon's parents headed out to visit a relative in the hospital, they left crystal clear instructions. The medicine had to be taken at exactly 10 o'clock in the evening, and exactly 10 milliliters. And they had to use the special oral syringe that came with it. Since the parents were out, 26-year-old Kira Holland stayed behind to watch Simon's younger siblings. She'd babysat for the family for years and was practically part of the family. They trusted her completely. Around bedtime, Simon started feeling sick again. When 10 o'clock rolled around, Kira went to the kitchen drawer to grab the dosing syringe, and it was nowhere to be found. Kira checked the bottle, saw how much he needed, and just wanted to do the right thing and help him out. So, she grabbed a regular old kitchen tablespoon. Now, obviously, a kitchen spoon doesn't have milliliter markings. Investigators later believed that Kira accidentally gave Simon less than the required 10 milliliters. Without the oral syringe, she had no way to measure the dose accurately and likely underestimated the amount while trying to avoid giving him too much. She poured the medicine into the spoon and handed it to Simon. He took it, thanked her, and went upstairs to bed. I can't help but think about how neither of them had any clue that anything was wrong. Around 2 in the morning, Simon suffered a major seizure in his bedroom while everyone else slept. Investigators believed he briefly woke after the first episode and tried to sit up before another seizure struck. The seizures became increasingly violent. He repeatedly struck the bed, headboard, and nearby furniture, leaving blood on his bedding from severe tongue injuries. His breathing became erratic, and his oxygen levels dropped rapidly. At some point, Simon rolled face down into the bedding. Investigators found a knocked-over lamp, broken picture frame, and signs of repeated convulsions throughout the room. With nobody awake to help him, his body eventually gave out. Just after 6 in the morning, Simon's parents walked through the door. His mom went upstairs to check on him and found him completely unresponsive. She panicked and called for emergency. Paramedics rushed over in about 7 minutes. But it was already too late. The signs showed Simon had passed away hours earlier. They tried to bring him back, but there was nothing they could do. The medical examiner confirmed the worst: severe tongue injuries, clear signs of repeated seizures, and a lack of oxygen. The toxicology report showed that the level of anti-seizure medication in his system was way too low. Investigators compared the medication level in Simon's body with his prescribed dosage and concluded that he likely received only a partial dose that night. The death was ruled a complete accident. The police found zero evidence of foul play or bad intentions. It was just a devastating mistake. Investigators concluded that the missing syringe had likely been discarded hours before the medication was given. It was never found. For Kira, that became the hardest part. There was no object to point to, no single moment she could undo. In the years that followed, she volunteered with local epilepsy foundations and medication safety campaigns. At community events, she often demonstrated how to properly measure liquid medicine using oral syringes. Family members later said she spent the rest of her life trying to prevent someone else from making the same mistake she did that night. And the next story is another reminder that sometimes one overlooked detail is all it takes. It was October 11th, 2016, at a truck repair shop in Fort Worth, Texas. The afternoon shift was in full swing, and the place was loud and busy. Among those workers was 42-year-old Thaddeus Anderson. Thad had nearly 20 years of experience and was the guy everyone went to when a diagnostic problem was too complicated to figure out. He was methodical and always followed safety rules to the letter. It's always the most careful people who get caught in the worst situations, and that part just kills me. Outside of work, Thad was a dedicated husband and father to 2 daughters, and he was even prepping for a big promotion. That afternoon, a delivery company brought in a box truck because of a scraping noise underneath. The inspection was routine, but company policy required strict safety steps: transmission in park, parking brake engaged, and wheel chocks in place. Security footage later showed exactly how things unraveled. As Thad was getting the truck ready, his phone rang. His wife was calling about a surgery their youngest daughter was scheduled for. Almost at the same time, another mechanic walked up with a question. Thad stepped away, handled the call, helped his coworker, and went back to work. We've all been there, trying to juggle a million things at once, but for Thad, that one moment of distraction changed everything. Investigators later figured out he had finished almost all the safety steps. He shifted the truck into park, but he completely missed the parking brake. The floor looked flat, but it actually had a slight slope, just enough to let the truck roll. Thad slid under the truck on his creeper and started checking the suspension. Everything was quiet for about 15 minutes. Then, the truck started inching forward. At first, Thad thought someone had hopped into the cab. Witnesses heard a scraping sound and then Thad yelling. He tried to push himself backward, but his shirt sleeve snagged on a bracket. The creeper twisted sideways, and he was trapped right in the truck's path. The rear axle caught him and pinned him against the concrete. Co-workers turned at the sound and saw the truck moving. It's terrifying to think about. But witnesses said they saw him trying to fight and push himself free, but the vehicle was just too heavy. One wheel rolled over him before the truck finally hit another vehicle and stopped. A mechanic called 911 immediately, and 3 others tried to lift the truck with jacks, but it was no use. Firefighters arrived about 8 minutes later, but by the time they freed Thad, he had already gone into cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy showed massive internal injuries, a crushed chest, broken ribs, and ruptured organs. The report stated the injuries were simply not survivable. When investigators looked at the footage, they were shocked. It's so incredibly sad to realize that a guy who spent years preaching safety protocols was the one who missed a single step because of a split-second distraction. The shop later introduced a mandatory safety step. Mechanics are now required to physically touch and verbally confirm the parking brake before going under any vehicle. I keep thinking about Thad and that missed parking brake, but the next story proves that sometimes it only takes 4 seconds to change everything. Before we get to the next one, if you're new here, go ahead and tap follow, because this story still isn't the most heartbreaking one tonight. It was August 12th, 2015, on Interstate 40 near Amarillo, Texas. Traffic moved steadily under clear skies as drivers passed through an active construction zone. Orange warning signs directed vehicles into fewer lanes, while road crews worked behind protective trucks and travelers continued east across the Panhandle. Now let's talk about Jonathan Holland. Jonathan was 46 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades hauling freight across the Southwest. He wasn't some reckless rookie. He was the guy younger truckers called when they needed advice. The man followed rules strictly, kept immaculate logbooks, and just didn't take dumb risks. His friends used to say he treated driving less like a job and more like a sacred responsibility. Off the road, Jonathan was a single dad raising his daughter Avery, and I totally get it. When you spend that much time away from home, you get protective. It just happens. Every single day, without fail, he'd check in to make sure she got home safe. Sure, she found it a little annoying sometimes, as teenagers do. For Jonathan, staying connected during those grueling trips mattered more than almost anything else, and I respect him for that. That afternoon, Jonathan was hauling a fully loaded trailer eastbound through one of those highway work zones. Electronic signs were flashing, warning everyone that the lanes were about to drop. Traffic was still moving, but things were starting to bunch up as everyone tried to squeeze into a single lane behind the construction equipment. At the same time, Avery was at home replying to her dad's usual text, asking if she got home safely. She started typing that she loved him and told him to drive safe, but deleted most of it because it felt too sentimental. Instead, she sent a short reply. As Jonathan approached the construction zone, his phone buzzed. Investigators later found no weather issues, mechanical problems, or signs of fatigue. The road was dry, visibility was clear, and the only thing he needed to do was slow down for traffic ahead. But data recovered from the truck later showed that Jonathan looked down at his phone for about 4 seconds. Just 4 seconds. It sounds like nothing, right? But at highway speeds, that truck covered hundreds of feet blindly. Ahead of him, brake lights were lighting up. A pickup changed lanes. Several vehicles were slowing down behind a highway maintenance truck, one of those big rigs equipped with a massive crash cushion designed to protect workers. Jonathan never saw it coming. When he finally looked back up, the gap in front of him was just gone. Witnesses said they heard tires violently lock up. Dashcam footage showed him slamming on the brakes and trying to swerve less than a second before impact. It just wasn't enough time. The semi slammed into the attenuator truck at highway speed. The cushion absorbed part of the impact, but the force was still enormous. Jonathan's cab crumpled around him, the windshield exploded, and debris scattered across the roadway. Witnesses immediately called emergency services. Crews arrived about 8 minutes later, but the cab was so badly crushed they could barely reach him. The one silver lining is that the road workers survived because the protective truck took the hit it was designed for. When I read the medical examiner's report, it noted extensive blunt force trauma throughout his body. The investigation dragged on for several weeks. Inspectors went through the truck with a fine-tooth comb, checked maintenance records, and watched the dashcam footage. No speeding, no drugs or alcohol, no fatigue, no mechanical failure. The final report laid it out plain and simple. Driver distraction was the primary cause. Jonathan's story is heartbreaking because nobody was reckless. But the next case shows how even the most routine task can become fatal in seconds. It was September 19th, 2017 in Columbus, Ohio. The warehouse was busy, but honestly, it was just a totally ordinary Tuesday afternoon. You had forklifts buzzing between the aisles, delivery trucks backing into the loading bays, and workers prepping outgoing shipments. Right in the middle of all this was 34-year-old Teddy Robles. He'd spent nearly 9 years at this distribution center, and man, he knew that warehouse better than most of the bosses did. Teddy actually started out as a temporary worker unloading trucks and literally worked his way all the way up to inventory control. His co-workers really respected him because he wasn't a complainer, and he was always the first guy to volunteer for an extra shift if someone needed help. Outside of work, Teddy was raising 2 young sons with his wife. They were doing what so many of us do, saving every spare dollar for a small house. That's why he worked so much overtime. He wanted a stable future for his family. Friends described him as careful and practical, the kind of guy who checked instructions twice before doing anything important. That afternoon, Teddy was preparing pallets for shipment by cutting away layers of shrink wrap so workers could check inventory. It was one of the most routine jobs in the warehouse, something employees did countless times every week. Now, the company had a strict rule. If you're using a box cutter, you have to wear cut-resistant gloves. Management hammered this policy home all the time because a few workers had ended up with nasty hand injuries in the past. But on this specific afternoon, Teddy's gloves had gotten completely soaked while he was unloading a leaking shipment, so he left them at his station to dry out. Here's the thing. There were replacement gloves available, but they were over in another part of the warehouse. Walking over to get them would have only taken a few minutes, but we've all been there. You just want to finish the job quickly before the next truck arrives. Teddy decided to just push through without them. Security footage later showed him slicing away, removing layer after layer of plastic wrap with a utility knife in his right hand. The pallet had large cartons, stacked nearly chest high. Witnesses said the plastic was stretched crazy tight because the load had shifted while moving. Teddy leaned forward, pulling the tight wrap with one hand while cutting downward with the other. A few guys nearby were working on their own pallets and didn't pay any attention because, again, this looked like the most ordinary thing in the world. And then the blade punched through the plastic way faster than he expected. The resistance just vanished instantly. The knife slipped free and kept traveling downward with tremendous force, right into the inside of Teddy's upper thigh. Multiple co-workers later said they heard him shout and saw him immediately drop the knife onto the concrete floor. At first, nobody realized how bad it actually was. The cut itself looked relatively small. One worker later told investigators that it just looked like a simple, shallow slice. But then, blood started pouring through Teddy's pants. Within seconds, it was spreading across the floor. Surveillance footage shows a crowd of employees rushing over to him while another guy grabs a handful of paper towel. A shift supervisor called 911 at approximately 3:18 p.m. His co-workers did everything they could to stop the bleeding using towels and even a belt as a makeshift tourniquet. But despite their best efforts, the bleeding was just too heavy. Emergency crews got there in about 8 minutes, but by then, Teddy was pale, confused, and fading fast. Paramedics got a real tourniquet on him and rushed him to the hospital. Tragically, his heart stopped during emergency surgery, and they couldn't bring him back. When I read the coroner's report, it was just devastating. The blade had completely severed his femoral artery, which is one of the biggest blood vessels in your entire body. The report noted that the wound itself was actually pretty narrow, but it was all about location. It was just a catastrophic spot to get cut. The official cause of death was blood loss from an accidental utility knife injury. Investigators found no equipment failure, and the warehouse followed proper safety procedures. The accident happened because Teddy chose to keep working without protective gloves. Afterward, the company required workers to have gloves before checking out utility knives and placed trauma kits throughout the warehouse. For Teddy's family, those changes came too late. A routine task ended with a split-second mistake.